Participants are coming in. Excellent, excellent, excellent. So we should have a Department of Religion and Culture theme song that we can kind of play like at the beginning of these events or something. So something that won't get us sued, but could be kind of interesting. So
as chair, is it not your job to hum?
It's probably my job to hum, and I'm just falling down on the job, honestly, right now. So I think I'm actually doing a service by not singing, honest, because
I was gonna say I am not the you don't want me to sing. It's not gonna be a good thing.
So all right. Well, if it's okay, I think we'll get going. I wanted to welcome our participants. My name is Matthew Gabriel. I'm the chair of the Department of Religion and Culture here at Virginia Tech. And it's my great pleasure to introduce very briefly this session. This is the third and final of the fall 2020 webinars that have been hosted by the Department of Religion and Culture here at Virginia Tech. We will send you an email shortly afterwards about joining our events listserv. We hope to have more of these events in the spring, and maybe, knock on wood, someday they'll even be in person once this is all over. Can't go on forever, right? So. But I have done my job, so I'm going to disappear for now, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Shaily Patel, who will be the host for today's event. So enjoy.
Thank you. I'm Shaily Patel. I am Assistant Professor of Early Christianity here in the Department of Religion and Culture. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. With us is Professor Darby Orcutt, who has a wide range of expertise. And this is an understatement on my part. Currently, he is faculty at North Carolina State University, where he serves as a librarian, teaching faculty, and interdisciplinary scholar, affiliated with several research centers. He's a library leader and pioneer in data science support, a frequent speaker on science and the paranormal, co-PI of a National Science Foundation grant studying hurricane impacts, and the host of the Momentum HSS podcast, which highlights issues in the humanities and social sciences academy. His professional activities include everything from invited lectures at Harvard University to a feature in the documentary film Paranormal Bigfoot to a summer sprint trapping and tattooing bears. Professor Orcutt brings this vast range of expertise to his classroom as well. He teaches courses in critical theory, information sciences, and popular culture. In his course, Science, Sci, Sasquatch, and Spirits, he examines science through the lens of fields usually considered fringe sciences at best, using these marginalized fields to understand how the boundaries and practices of science are constructed. In today's talk, entitled Science and Sasquatch in Popular Culture, he draws from experiences with the Bigfoot community and his fieldwork with amateur Bigfoot investigators and turns them towards popular understandings of science and Bigfoot, ultimately finding that ways of believing in these things are not so different as we might imagine. So I would like to just take a minute and welcome Professor Orcutt, and thank you all again for being with us tonight. And so I will turn it over to Professor Orcutt.
Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much, Shaily, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Virginia Tech's Department of Religion and Culture for the kind invitation to speak tonight. If you aren't familiar with my friend, the Sasquatch, or more familiarly, Bigfoot, he really rose to fame in the late 1960s to 1970s. A lot of people got their first glimpse of him on In Search Of, a television documentary series devoted to mysterious phenomena, hosted by the late Leonard Nimoy of Star Trek fame. Bigfoot went on to be a relatively stable fixture on the small screen well into the 1980s, and perhaps hit his height in 1987, when he starred alongside John Lithgow in the feature film Harry and the Hendersons, a comedy still beloved by many to this day. But it was kind of downhill from there. Maybe the skeptics and the haters got to him, but by 2006, he was shilling for Jack Link's. And like many former B-list celebrities, the biggest gigs he can now get are on reality TV shows. Outside of these venues, he's been exceptionally good at avoiding the paparazzi who are constantly trying to snap his photo, and seems actually quite reclusive. Yet he's still got a devoted fan base, and I see him frequently when I'm invited to speak at conventions and festivals. And there's no question he's got a lot of boosters still today who would love for the general public to take him more seriously. But given this public image, why would anyone take Sasquatch seriously? That's one of the questions, I'm pleased to say, that we address in my NC State University course, Science, Sci, Sasquatch, and Spirits, where we examine not so much of the silliness of media representations, nor the knee-jerk dismissals of skeptics who can't be bothered to examine potential evidence. Rather, I and my students roll up our sleeves and look at the best of potential evidence across several fringe science fields, along the way coming to a better understanding of how scientific communities operate both in and as cultures of practice. Tonight, however, I'm going to focus on approaches to science and Sasquatch in general belief. And I appreciate from the start that belief can be something of a fraught term. I want you to relax about it. I mean it very colloquially, simply as what one believes. There are a lot of things and a lot of ways that one can believe in something. You may believe in God. You may believe that spinach tastes better than cauliflower, or you may believe that if you fall from a great height, you will die. Some beliefs you may hold much more firmly, others you will change today. Some you believe with scant evidence, others with much evidence, and likely most of what you believe, you couldn't truly say why, because you're really just trusting in what others believe, whether experts or, perhaps more typically, what you perceive as a general consensus of those around you. Now, it's not a bad thing to believe things just because others do. Humans are social creatures, and our distribution of labor and knowledge has allowed us as a species to, many thousands of years, begin agriculture, and today to edit our genes or talk via Zoom. But it should be impetus for personal humility that our much lauded opposable thumbs wouldn't allow any of us to text if we first had to build our own smartphone from scratch. So at the start, I gave you some basic background on Bigfoot, the media star, but let me fill that in a bit more on what Bigfoot's public image has been. The American public at large became aware of Bigfoot in the late 1950s to late 1960s through one of two key media events. The first, in 1958, was the extensive newspaper coverage around the find of large human-like footprints at a road construction site near Bluff Creek, California. In fact, this is when the term Bigfoot was coined, and it remains the most common name for the alleged creature in the United States. Nearly a decade later, in 1967, also along Bluff Creek in Northern California, two of the earliest amateur Bigfoot investigators shot what is now known as the Patterson-Gimlin film, which arguably stands as the mental image that most Americans have of Bigfoot, allegedly portraying a female creature often referred to as Patty. Note that I said a female creature. It's not uncommon to find people who think of Bigfoot as a singular monster of that name, like Godzilla or King Kong. But it has generally been seen as a possible hidden species, necessarily meaning male, female, and some sort of sustainable population. It's important to note, too, that while Bigfoot as a term dates to 1958, the more popular Canadian term, Sasquatch, derives from the 1920s and is itself rooted in an amalgamation of historic Native American terms for large, hairy, human-like creatures. So the legend is actually far from recent. Lastly, with regard to popular ideas of Bigfoot, the dominant cultural framing of Bigfoot is as a joke. Mass media either plays it up that way or covers simply the sensational aspects without even a modicum of investigation. For example, in 2014, news of a Bigfoot body made waves online and earned an article in Time magazine and others, despite the fact that the Bigfoot hunter who supposedly shot the creature, Rick Dyer, had already confessed to hoaxing a body just a few years earlier, and his supposed 2008 find had similarly been covered by CNN and other outlets at that time. The same happens in reverse also with regard to hoax claims. The family of Ray Wallace, a key figure in the 1958 footprint find, claimed he had hoaxed the prints and produced the molds he allegedly used to do so. The national media declared Bigfoot dead without an autopsy, although a quick visual scan, and let's do it right now. This is the larger picture with the 3 feet. In the middle is the alleged mold that was produced by the Wallace family, and on the 2 sides are the actual cast of the prints that were found at the time. We all probably learned on Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the others. Just take a careful look at that. Do you see there's any way that that mold actually made those prints? So what happened? The media covered this without even looking at their own. It was later revealed that the family had actually been peddling Ray Wallace's story to Hollywood. No fewer than 3 men over the years have claimed to be wearing an ape suit in the famous Patty film, and each of them has enjoyed their 15 minutes of fame alongside media claims of case closed. It's clear that in the popular media, whether it's boosting or denying Bigfoot, there are no shortage of uncritical claims, or dare I say, fake news. So I want to take you now into the world of the Bigfoot researcher. I've spent quite a few years researching this community, not only through interviews and conversations, attending and speaking about science at Bigfoot conferences and festivals, but actually going boots on the ground with amateur investigators in sometimes very remote wilderness locations. Let's go ahead and get it out of the way. Yes, some of these people seem crazy. At the first Bigfoot conference I ever attended, when I was just starting to conceive the course, a man caught me just before the first session. He said, "Do you want to see an amazing video of a Bigfoot?" "Sure," I said. There I was, squinting into his small phone screen at a dark image of what looked like a trail of smoke rising from a shag carpet, twisting and turning slowly in a column in front of a blurry old television set. The man said, "Here's one materializing in my friend's living room." As my first experience at a Bigfoot conference, this made me seriously question my own sanity in looking into this field. Yet, I persisted. Quite more common in the Bigfoot community is the really hopeful observer. The butt of many jokes, many of these folks often report large numbers of encounters, claiming to see Sasquatch even nearly every time they walk into the woods. Frequently, too, they overinterpret observations to support Sasquatch claims. A broken branch, they claim, was snapped off by a Bigfoot. An indistinguishable impression in the earth? That's something they cast in plaster as a footprint. Before I learned to sift my subjects better, I spent a night in the field with one amateur investigator. Disheartened by the lack of Sasquatch activity that he promised to show me, "Honestly," he says, "this is the first time I've come here and they haven't been around." In the morning, he told me that the dog we'd heard barking in the direction of some distant houses had perhaps been a Bigfoot. "They mimic dogs sometimes to disguise themselves," he claimed. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that even if I saw a Bigfoot and I watched it bark like a dog, even after that, I'd still assume that dog barks coming from the vicinity of houses were probably dogs. Perhaps the most common overinterpreting that one sees is of purported photographic evidence. Some people, it seems, can detect a Bigfoot in any photograph of foliage. As this photo and enhancement shared by one amateur investigator show, just modest manipulation of pictures and a healthy dose of imagination can reveal a Sasquatch. In fact, many claim to discover Bigfoots in old photos, the photos that others posted online, or, my personal favorite, some amateur researchers, as represented by this picture, in fact, intentionally backpack with a rear-facing video camera shooting pictures of the woods behind them. They claim that Bigfoots and other unknown creatures materialize briefly in the foliage to watch them as they leave. Some self-report spending many hours going through such footage frame by frame to find just the one where a face suddenly appears. The phenomenon is known as Paradoia, where the human mind identifies a pattern, especially a face, where there is none. In part, it's why smiley faces and cartoons work. As Scott McCloud notes in his seminal work, Understanding Comics, we humans can see faces everywhere. Again, if you want to stop with the low-hanging fruit, there are bushels of it in the Bigfoot community. And I haven't even gotten to the woo. Just wait a minute for that. But I've been fascinated by the flip side of the coin too. By the many, and yes, there are many, otherwise normal, rational-seeming human beings who are not only convinced that there may be something more than mere story to the Bigfoot legend, but many of whom report their own firsthand experiences. The easy skeptical denial of Sasquatch reports as all lies or misidentified bears is extremely difficult in the face of a cogent eyewitness. I'm oft reminded of William James' approach in his Varieties of Religious Experience as to how to judge the authenticity of another's experience beyond simple material measures. Genuine experiences, at least psychologically genuine experiences, may be seen as such because they affect a change in the individual. And certainly to hear the account of, say, a lifelong hunter who gives up his favorite activity and never ventures into the woods again, beginning the day of his reported encounter, this is powerful. For another example, William Tranginis, a now deceased Bigfoot investigator from here in Virginia. Bill and two friends were out in the Virginia woods metal detecting when they experienced what Bill reported as a clear daytime sighting of a Bigfoot creature. That experience set Bill on a 20-plus year trajectory of spending virtually all of his free time and money well into the six figures, seeking to document evidence of what he saw as a highly elusive unknown species. And I have to admit to an extremely strong curiosity as to what actually happened in these moments. But my academic interest is more in how these individuals in our culture put these things together. There's observation on the one hand and interpretation on the other. So let me tell you about the time I saw a UFO. Back in the 1980s, when I was a teenager, I looked out my bedroom window one morning and I saw something that shouldn't have been possible. A strangely shaped craft unlike anything known to exist, and that moved in a way unlike anything known to exist. The experience seemed so singular to me at the time that I immediately afterwards drew a picture of what I'd seen and jotted down notes about how it had looked and behaved, something I'd never done before with any other experience, but felt compelled to do as this experience was so unusual. In 1988, the United States Air Force publicly revealed the B-2 stealth bomber, an aircraft that had been in development for a decade and looked and moved in extremely different ways than any other aircraft before it. And as soon as I saw it, I concluded that I must have seen some sort of test flight or prototype of this aircraft. For me, The UFO I had seen was now an IFO, an identified flying object. Had I seen a UFO? Absolutely. It was literally an unidentified flying object. Did I ever think it was a spaceship sent from an otherworldly civilization? Well, that'd be cool, but no, not really. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to interpret or make sense of my observation, and so I bracketed it until I felt more comfortable doing so. What I'm hoping to illustrate here is the distinction between an observation or experience and an interpretation or an explanation of that experience. And while my experience was unusual enough that I felt the need to document it, I could and I did set it aside. Of course, had I instead seen a little green person beam down from the craft and speak to me, I might have been much more shaken up, more eager for an explanation, and much more interested in some quicker closure. Bill Dranginis was far from the only Bigfoot eyewitness to report to me that his unexpected experience initially elicited a flood of thoughts as he processed it over the following weeks and months, not the least of which asking himself, if this is real, what else is real? UFOs, ghosts, what? This sort of reaction feels, on the one hand, very natural, but it's really an example of culture making second nature. Why would we take such vastly different accounts of Bigfoot, UFOs, hauntings, psychic powers, astrology, and group all of these together? These are quite different subjects that can only be classified as one thing, the paranormal, when we focus primarily on our intellectual relationship to them as things unknown. Regardless, this simplistic division of science and the paranormal is propagated by both paranormal believers on the one hand and hardcore scientific skeptic believers on the other. Meanwhile, when asked in regular Gallup polls about 10 paranormal ideas, one by one, about 75% of Americans consistently hold to at least one of these paranormal ideas, but only 1% to all of them. The binary choice, however, is what is offered culturally, and in large part because of the media success of the Western skeptical movement, what are often referred to as capital S skeptics, who hold out science, with a capital S, as an alternative to belief, rather than what it truly is at its root, a type of belief. Let me take a quick time out here because I know this is a hard thing for many people to grasp. I'm not saying that all beliefs are inherently equal or equally plausible. I'm a big fan of science, and I'm very concerned that it be communicated and used effectively in our society. This is what a lot of my career is about. But I also don't think it serves us well to deify science, either its methods or its current content, as somehow having cornered the market on reality or truth. Recent science has itself, in fact, confirmed that human perception of an objective reality is illusory. But that's another talk for another day. So back to the matter at hand. This forced binary choice in our culture to either accept science as if it were one thing, or to embrace all paranormal ideas, no matter how uncritically held, certainly puts the majority of Americans in a difficult space of cognitive dissonance. Believing on the one hand that science is a highly useful tool for living modern life, and on the other hand, that there may be at least some things, and perhaps some very strange things, that are yet unknown to us. Science itself is driven by curiosity, and we as people are curious about strange phenomena, strange experiences, and questions that science usually doesn't seem disposed to ask. I think that's a big part of why my course fills up so quickly. I'm not arguing that paranormal research should be well-funded and prioritized within the mainstream scientific community, but I am saying that if questions that are significant to so many are dismissed without inquiry, that drives people elsewhere to seek answers. Today's Bigfoot community shows us what happens when curious individuals are left to fend for themselves. For one, many do embrace a full range of strangeness. Sasquatch are claimed to mind speak, or to be psychic, or spiritual beings. They are said to cloak, to teleport, or to be interdimensional. I've heard individuals firsthand claiming to share dreams with Sasquatch. To many, a UFO or alien connection seems obvious. Even the Bible offers an alternative narrative for many Christian believers who equate Bigfoot with demons or with the biblical Nephilim. This entire side of the Bigfoot community is often what is referred to as the woo. On the other end of the spectrum are the flesh and blood proponents, including amateur investigators and even a handful of professional scientists who seek to apply the tools of scientific research to the subject. Unfortunately, what's most lacking in this end of the community is critical apparatus for judgment. It's difficult for amateurs to alone sift better potential evidence from worse, although many have gone to great lengths to educate themselves through reading mainstream scientific text, studying primatology, or taking master naturalist or other adult education courses. What's publicly presented as Bigfoot science, however, is sometimes anything but science, as individuals often take a do-it-yourself approach to building theory. A wonderful example of this is Bigfoot investigator Ron Moorhead's notion of the quantum Bigfoot. Now, Ron is a well-established figure in the Bigfoot community, having recorded what are known as the Sierra sounds, which are extended possible Bigfoot vocalizations. Ron's subsequent and some very strange observations in the field led him to develop his quantum Bigfoot theory as a sort of reconciliation of science and the woo. Now, let me say, I've met Ron and I've had several interactions with Ron. In my experience, he's a good guy, and I have no reason to doubt the integrity of the observations, the experiences that he reports. But his quantum interpretation of them is flawed. He begins his case by explaining how classical Newtonian physics seemed correct for centuries, but because it was only being applied to physics at an earthbound level. Albert Einstein and quantum physics came along later and revealed that while Newtonian physics works as a model for much of what we observe, at least on Earth, looking at the much smaller level of particles and of the much larger level of galaxies offers a very different picture. Centuries accepted science that works well in countless examples, was nonetheless wrong, or at least incomplete. Moorhead's metaphor for how science can sometimes work yet be wrong, for how science has the potential to utterly change its view on a subject, is dead on. The advent of quantum physics shows that mainstream scientific models can be replaced given the introduction of new evidence. Cool. And perhaps observations and new evidence could lead to an accepted scientific model for Bigfoot. Okay. The problem comes when Ron Moorhead starts to take the metaphor literally. He suggests that maybe quantum physics explains the unusual Bigfoot phenomena that he and others report. However, he fundamentally misunderstands quantum physics. Although in fairness, he's far from the only popular writer to completely fail to grasp quantum theory. But his prior mistake comes in his taking a perfectly good metaphor of how the rise of quantum theory may foreshadow the eventual triumph of a Sasquatch hypothesis, and then taking it too far and indeed literally, to claim that quantum theory itself explains the Bigfoot phenomenon. Ironically, his slippage from metaphor to literalism is the same error made by those capital S skeptics on the other side of the so-called science paranormal divide in popular belief. For example, when those capital S skeptics take scientific models rooted in the assumption that reality is composed of matter and energy, and then allow those models to convince them that they have proven that reality is therefore only composed of matter and energy. There's a lot of poor science in attempts to study Sasquatch hypotheses. One of the most famous examples is the well-publicized DNA study led by Texas veterinarian Dr. Melba Ketchum. She and her team analyzed more than 100 possible samples of Bigfoot hair and a few other things. Unfortunately, their experimental design, protocols, and conclusions reveal a fundamental lack of expertise and understanding in how to conduct and interpret the ambitious research they were attempting. Yet, when they submitted their manuscript for peer review in mainstream scientific journals, it also seems clear that some rejected the paper merely for its premise, not for its actual deficiencies, therefore feeding a then not fully conspiracy theory narrative that mainstream science rejected their work simply because it challenged the status quo. Even those who are meticulous in doing the science well have an almost impossible time getting a hearing. The late wildlife biologist Dr. John Bindernagel did a remarkable job of gathering much of the best evidence supporting a Sasquatch hypothesis in his book, The Discovery of the Sasquatch, wherein he also explores the cultural and historical reasons why science may shun any investigation of the matter. He and I used to laugh about how we'd come to similar questions from very different perspectives. He looking at cultural practices of the scientific community in order to understand why Sasquatch evidence was not taken seriously, and me coming to examine Sasquatch investigation as a window into how scientific communities draw their cultural boundaries. At this point in my study of the scientific and Bigfoot communities, I can tell you that the cultural differences at their points of intersection are much stronger than individuals' differing perspectives at a personal level. Teaching a course like my Science, Sci, Sasquatch, and Spirits, I've been amazed at how many academic colleagues feel comfortable talking to me about their paranormal interests or experiences. I frequently hear from fellow faculty, "I don't believe in this stuff, but let me tell you about what happened to me." They don't believe in ghosts in general, but they believe in the authenticity of their own experience. I hear in hushed tones from well-regarded scientists who suspect Bigfoot might truly exist, and plenty of other scientists who largely doubt the veracity of the legend, yet remain personally curious and certainly don't rule it out like they know they're supposed to do publicly. I've also found in the Bigfoot community a lot of folks with a very sincere desire to learn about science. I've spoken at Bigfoot conferences and festivals in several rural communities where hundreds of people have shown up to hear me speak about how institutional science works. Stop and think about that. Hundreds of people have shown up to hear me talk about how institutional science works. For those of you who are concerned about science education and communication as I am, I want you to hear the potential here. One can be appropriately skeptical without being dismissive. And actually, there's a lot about the Sasquatch phenomenon, reports, and potential evidence to be quite curious about. However incredible it may seem, let's not take hypotheses and a body of potential evidence that scientists have not truly investigated and simply declare it bunk. Despite what capital S skeptics argue, entertaining the possibility of Bigfoot doesn't undermine scientific literacy. I would argue, at the very least, what does it hurt? Perhaps the greater hazard is actually in the denial, a hazard to the credibility of science itself, which would certainly be diminished for having so vociferously dismissed Bigfoot if someday such a creature is indeed shown to exist. Rather than emphasize dismissing an unstudied phenomenon, proponents of science have plenty of work to do boosting the signal on questions that scientists have investigated and that we do know a great deal about. Vaccinations, the current pandemic, climate change. Here we have issues with infinitely greater human and ecological cost for getting things wrong. So I say, why not embrace the Bigfoot? At least a little. Thank you.
Thanks to Professor Orcutt. I would like to invite anybody to drop questions into the Q&A if you have any for Professor Orcutt. And while you're doing that, let me start with a question that I had. Early in your talk, you called scientific communities communities of practice. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that? You're laughing because you know I was going to ask you this question, right?
Oh. Well, yeah, and I imagine you're asking it in part because that's how we oftentimes think of religious communities as communities of practice, and it is the case. I think that anything that can be identified as a community among humans probably is a community of practice, a group of people who have similar practices, or they have codified these in science. Oftentimes in different scientific fields, that's codified through particular protocols, through established theory and models of understanding the topic of the discipline. But in addition, there are within all communities, and even all scientific communities, it's not just about the science. There's the human element that's there. And when any of us practice as part of a community, we can't divorce ourselves from all the other communities that we are a part of. And so that's why there's this constant interplay that goes on between the popular culture and even the culture of scientific disciplines, where there are decisions made about what direction do we go, or what's right, what's wrong. I think that one of the things that's really interesting is that there are very different impacts of this oftentimes between different scientific disciplines. There are some that make decisions for very different reasons and in very different ways, and just operate under different cultural norms. And that's something that I think a lot of folks don't understand. I know in my class, for example, one of the things that we talk about is p-values. And that sounds like, hey, it's math, it's statistics, a very boring thing to think about. But one of the things that's very interesting for them is understanding that in their different disciplines, they're oftentimes taught that a p-value of X is significant. And when students of different majors sit there and talk, and they realize, oh, in your discipline, that number is different than it is in my discipline. And so that's one of the reasons we pull that apart and really understand what does p-value mean. So even the most seemingly innocuous or seemingly quantitative norms have culture embedded in them.
So related to that, we do have a few questions. Let me start with one. from Leslie. Leslie asks, do you believe that there are some people who deny belief in something solely because it scares them? Does that grant them some sense of security?
Well, I think I would argue that in general, a major component of any belief is security. And so I think for some people, there's a belief in something gives them security. For others, the something that they believe in may be a negative, but it's still a belief. And I think that's something that's really something that I see play over and over again in different communities, is that there are lots of reasons. There are lots of reasons to hold beliefs. There are lots of ways of believing. And that's one of the things that's really interesting to me, to see that. That's why I referred to those capital S skeptics as capital S skeptic scientific believers, because they're believing, they're invested. They're, in fact, that's the scientific atheism in America is a really interesting phenomenon, because it is so evangelistic. There is such a concern with convincing others that this is the truth. It is, it smacks of, Christian fundamentalism in the way that folks hold to this, and the way that they proselytize. And I may have lost the trail of the question there, but
No, I see your point. I mean, so I was thinking about where you brought up in your talk how the Bigfoot researchers had done this study that had some fundamental flaws as far as method is concerned, but journals rejected the study out of hand simply because of the subject matter or the premise, right? That to me is, I mean, to sort of use belief in this colloquial way, like already you've decided that this is a threat to your field, and so you're policing the boundaries of your field in that way.
Yeah. And that was Dr. John Bendernagle I mentioned. That was one of the things he had a couple of papers that he was trying to present at conferences that he typically had presented at previously, but because the subject was Sasquatch, he felt like he was not even being considered. I do think it's interesting. I did actually submit a proposal, and I actually ended up giving a talk at a scientific conference about the subject. And my peer reviews were very interesting. I got to see them, and the peer reviews were, and it was extremely interesting. And I have to say, I mean, honestly, one of the things that I didn't hit at in this talk, but I think is really interesting, is we spend a lot of time now in academic circles really thinking hard for years, and especially this year, about issues of diversity and equity and inclusion. And here's an area where, we can think about diversity of belief, or diversity of interest, and diversity of curiosity in science. As I started to work on this, I found that the scientific colleagues who were interested in working with me, I found a small number of folks who really thought this was interesting, didn't necessarily believe in Bigfoot. I'm not saying that, but just thought, okay, this could be interesting work. And at one point I stopped and I looked at my small group of colleagues just mentally, and I realized these were all scientists who were women of color. How rare is it to find more than a single woman of color who's a scientist in any given space? And yet here, it struck me that, asking questions that maybe challenge the norm might be a way of promoting that sort of diversity. And that was actually the way that I framed my proposal to the conference. I said, look, if we're going to be serious about entertaining relation, and this was particularly talking about working with citizen scientists. I mean, are amateur and Bigfoot investigators citizen scientists? That was my question. But if we're really serious about working with the general public, if we really want to work with publics, if we really want to work with the diversity of the world, then we might have to be willing to entertain the ideas. We might be having to ask the questions that are of interest to all kinds of communities.
So related to that, Julia has a question and asks, is there a correlation between paranormal belief and trust or distrust in scientists about things like vaccines and climate change?
That's a great question. And I think that it's a question that a number of scholars have asked, but I don't think by and large that question has been framed in the right way. And I would really, if there are social scientists here who are interested in this, I'd really like to challenge them to think particularly understanding that paranormal belief is not something monolithic. As I said in the talk, practically everybody believes in something paranormal. And in fact, depending on how you define the paranormal, maybe we all believe in it. How many of us believe in the placebo effect? The idea that giving someone a sugar pill and telling them that it's actual medicine will make them better. That's been clinically demonstrated, but it's still paranormal because we have no idea why it works.
Right. So I taught a class called Magic, Science, and Religion. And one of the things that we talked about was nobody knows how things like antidepressants work, right? But we know that they work, right? And so we are more apt to believe in antidepressants or think of them as legitimate than, let's say, traditional healing practices. So what we looked at was things like tongue acupuncture, right? Or something like that, which my students were like, whoa, that's weird. I don't know about that. But again, we don't really know how antidepressants work, right? But it's a sanitized version. And so we're apt to say, at least in sort of the Western sphere, we're apt to say, oh, this seems legit in a way that maybe tongue acupuncture does not seem legit to us, right? So related to that, Candace asked a question. Do you think the allowance of certain discourses into particular fields provides them with legitimacy? And if you do, what responsibility do academics have in perpetuating the legitimacy of certain discourses?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that that I recognize as an academic, as university faculty, working with folks in these communities. And when I'm invited to speak at a Bigfoot festival, is that a legitimation of something or the other? I actually had a senior colleague who early in this time sort of advised me against, you don't want to get involved with this because, hey, people will say you're crazy or whatever it may be. You legitimize these folks, these crazy people. But the reality is, though, is that I've gotten very comfortable with that because I've just, I'm not going into, I think it's a mistake to go into working with any community with the idea that, somehow I have the knowledge and they don't. We all have knowledge. We all have understanding. It's a bit, it may be different, but that what can we learn from one another? And, I think that one of the things that's been very important for me is that when I go in and I give these talks, I'm not endorsing anything. I make it clear I'm not endorsing. I'm going to talk, and and honestly, I know that I'm going into some of these venues and I'm telling people things that they don't want to hear, but that's okay. But I'm, again, I'm not. But I guess that's it. I'm not rendering judgment. I mean, honestly, I mean, the question of, I mean, you can tell from my talk. I mean, the question of whether Bigfoot exists or not. I mean, yeah, it seems incredible, but hey, there are a lot of things that are real in the world that seem incredible. So, and and the more that I've seen working with folks in the field, and the more potential evidence that I've seen, the more I think, oh, maybe this should be an open question.
Well, I mean, okay, so we have a number of really fun questions, and I'm not ignoring the people who are asking these questions, so I do want to get to those. So Kara asks, what is the best or most interesting cryptid Bigfoot gathering you've been to?
Oh boy. I can't say that I've been to a wide range of them. I know there are lots of them that I've heard very good things about that I haven't been to. I would say that in terms of just the most fun, was and I had some pictures of it in the at the beginning in 2019 in small town of Westminster, South Carolina. They had the first annual South Carolina Bigfoot Festival, and they put on a great show, and it was a lot of fun. And there was the food vendors were out, and all the there was a street fair and a parade, and then there were all kinds of people actually talking, and and I was there. I was invited down to talk about science and how science works, and there were a lot of people who were just really engaged with that, and it was a lot of fun. They put on a great show, and they had to cancel it this year, of course, of the pandemic, but I hope they invite me back. That was a lot of fun. So that was the most fun. I don't know that I can say what was the most, informative or interesting from, intellectually.
So you don't have to answer this, but Julie wants to know why you were tattooing bears. Is this something you want to share?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, because you could just leave it and be super mysterious, right?
Well, I mean, there's money to be made when bears get drunk and want a tattoo. No, I was working as an assistant on a zoological project, and we were trapping black bears and putting radio collars on them, and drawing blood samples and things like that. And as part of that, one of my jobs was to tattoo a number on the bear so that we'd be able to keep track of it in the future and make sure we'd marked our bear. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I don't know that I would be interested in tattooing bears. I'm going to leave that one to you. So we have, let's see, we've got a number of thank yous. So we do have, James says, I believe the Sasquatch are a people. I've heard them speak and I've recorded some of my interactions. Thoughts? And by the way, the mechanisms of action for antidepressants is well known. I will have to look that up. I taught that class a while back, so I will have to do the research on that. So thanks for the correction on that. But thoughts about...
But I wasn't going to call you out.
Yeah, so this was way back. But thoughts about James's recordings and interactions.
This is one of the areas where looking at potential evidence can get really interesting. And one of the times when I teach the course, I always try to focus on something a little bit different each time. And one of the things that I really do want to get into are the recordings, and really looking at analyzing those. There have been some really interesting recordings that people claim are Sasquatch, or certainly that seem very, very different than any known animals. And there are ways to look at those, and yeah, I mean, I mean, that's an interesting area, where I think that the evidence hasn't really been investigated like it could be. Now, it is a little bit tenuous to try to be able to make the connection. I mean, most of the people who are recording are not, they're not on Zoom with a Sasquatch recording. They're putting a recorder out in the woods, or they're they're recording something that they're not watching make the sounds. And so, there's a little bit more of a tenuous connection there, and a little, there's, the burden of evidence, from a scientific standpoint, to be able to connect this with then an unknown creature is, fairly high. But yeah, I think it's, I think that I've heard some interesting things, and that's an area that I really look forward to delving into with my students, maybe next semester, or maybe sometime in the near future, I hope.
You'll have to keep us posted.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that I have been out in the field with a lot of investigators, and some of them are more optimistic about things that they hear than others. Let's put it that way. I've heard some known animal sounds that, including that barking dog that that some amateur investigators have attributed to Bigfoot. But I've also heard some really fascinating recordings that, if they're genuine recordings, they're not hoaxed, then they're really, really interesting and really worth investigation, regardless of what they turn out to be. It would be very interesting.
Well, so we are close to time. Is there anything that anybody else in the audience would like to ask Professor Orcutt? Okay, well, if not, then once again, let me just thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you, Professor Orcutt, for your time this evening. It's really good to see you. It's really good to hear from you. This is really fun work. So thanks for taking the time.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. I appreciate everyone who showed up, and thank you so much.